Loren Schoenberg. Welcome. We're back for another one of our Benny Goodman sessions here. We're deep into the thesaurus, the Rhythm Makers Orchestra sessions, and along with me are my co-guides throughout this whole crazy enterprise. And that is drummer Hal Smith, coming to us from Arkansas. From California, we have guitarist, and as you can see, banjoist, no jokes please, Nick Rossi. And they are wonderful historians on top of instrumentalists. And the whole idea here is that we're listening to this music through the vantage point of the music itself. Lord knows there's a lot of discography, a lot of history, and a lot of things that we are not even touching upon. We're kind of listening to the music first through the prism of the rhythm section, and then just talking about the bands, the arrangements, the times, having a lot of fun doing it. I hope that you're having fun. You're watching us, so you must be enjoying it. We'll set out the band personnel during the first track that we listen to, so you can see who's on it. If you'd like more details, in the previous show that we did kind of go into more detail about some of the players and all this kind of stuff, and we'll get back to it later. So let's go right to the music, if we might. We'll begin with the Fletcher Henderson arrangement. This is I Would Do Most Anything for You. Interesting, here it's recorded a year before Goodman made his Victor recording of it. Let's listen, and we'll be back with some talk.
that's the perfect display of how to play in a big band when you're a drummer. I don't think you could improve on what Gene Krupa played there. Everything just perfect. He brought it in very strong, playing the hi-hat to get a lot of forward momentum. He played accented rim shots in places you might not expect them to keep it interesting. He went back to the hi-hat behind the trumpet, and he was playing afterbeats, beats 2 and 4 on the snare drum, probably overhand, like we talked about last week, with his one hand reaching over the hi-hat hand to play the snare drum. And that's how he played in that era, but he was really popping the rim shots, making him really go. Some tom-tom accents, turnarounds, fills, or whatever you want to call them, and some press rolls behind the piano. I heard some ride cymbal. And one thing that I really admire that some drummers just don't get, he played 2 cymbal crashes to cue a flare by the whole band. Da 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 wah. He did it twice, so it wasn't an accident. He was doing that on purpose. But that's a big band thing for drummers to do. Not always written in the music. If you know the arrangement and you know there's a swell or a flare coming by the whole ensemble, you can cue that and hit 2 beats on the tom-tom, a rim shot, 2 beats on the bass drum, crash on the cymbal or the hi-hat, and he did it to perfection there. Just wonderful.
Yeah. There was also that odd bridge, like when he goes into the busy thing for 4 measures.
Yes.
Like what would you call that beat? At first, I think it's like a samba beat or a cha-cha. I don't know what in 1935 that was thought to be, but it's very interesting.
It is, and I don't know how I would characterize that. I don't know
a
name
Gene Krupa
for
beat
it.
with Benny Goodman, right?
That'll work. It was busy, but so was the bridge. So was the feeling on the bridge. He was just caught up in the spirit of it and making it even more exciting by doing that.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's true. You know, the way that people one approach to big band drumming, I guess, is to underline and to parrot what happens in the horns, and another way to do it, of course, is to play everything but that and to surround it with things. I think that's what you're talking about here. And
that's
what's
exactly
interesting,
right.
you know, when you compare it with the later versions, with the Victor version, which we'll get to, you can kind of see, like in utero almost, are all these little ideas that he's trying. But also, and I'd like to bring in Nick here, of course, which is that it seemed to me that this was a new they were playing a certain kind of flowing 4/4 time that we've not heard from them yet. I think it had something to do with the tempo, but it just seemed like from the moment that this particular performance started, it was like, you know, I mean, I think the technical way to express it is, you know, but it was just, you know, almost, you know, from the moment that it started, they were just like in floating 4/4 time in a way that we've not heard. It could be the tempo. I don't know why. I just felt something fresh and new about that. Nick, how did it strike you, this whole darn thing?
To pick up on what you're saying, how pardon me, Loren, you know,
Hal and I get confused all the time. You know, it's
all the time.
You know, it's the uniform, which, as Hal said before we started, clearly you did not get the memo. But anyway, buttons on the sleeves. I like it. That's good. Or as we say, fancy.
Yes.
Go ahead.
What were we
Just
saying?
kidding. Just kidding.
Oh, Benny Goodman, right? Yeah, definitely.
Who?
I heard a much more of a straightened out beat from the rhythm section, and not that there weren't accents there, right? You know, it's you're still hearing, or I still heard a lot of emphasis on the 2 and 4 from Roos, which of course, as we talked about before, is a big characteristic of his playing. But there's ways to make that emphasis without, you know, it sounding like boom chack, boom chack, boom chack. And that's to give a little bit more of an even placement of both of the beats, even though one is getting emphasized more than the other. I also heard Roos voicing his chords a little bit lower in terms of pitch. You know, the first Victor session, and even in the last couple of tunes we heard with the Rhythm Makers, you know, he was playing pretty high up the neck. And so it changes when you revoice your chords a little bit lower, it blends a little bit more at the rhythm section. If you think about it like a drum rather than hitting a snare, you're hitting a tom, for example. So it changes the flow of things and it makes it a little less jagged. So yeah, it definitely heard some flow, while at the same time heard characteristic playing, from all of the rhythm section members. Harry Goodman sounded wonderful. He was mixing it up between 2-feel as well as 4-feel. A couple of interesting parts for me from a rhythm section perspective was, again, under Benny's solo, where for so many records up until this point, we'd heard the rhythm section straightening out during his solo, going to more of a strict 4-feel. They actually kind of did the opposite here. They started putting a little bit more backbeat under his solo, which was a bit of an anomaly that we've heard so far. And it made for an interesting effect. And Benny, of course he didn't, but he didn't seem to flinch in terms of his playing over it. He seemed just as comfortable on something like that than he had before. And with regards to that kind of kooky little drum break, I think that was like a Roomba type feel. I think that was an example of an early Afro-Cuban thing. I mean, you got to remember, this is around the time of the Peanut Vendor being a massive hit record. Yeah. And I think my ears may be playing tricks on me, but I'd have to go back and listen again. I thought the soloist was about to quote Peanut Vendor. Either that or I just went to Peanut Vendor, whether he wanted me to or not. I was hearing it. But, it's...
Oh, no, I was going to say, I mean, they had just come off the Let's Dance show, opposite Xavier Cugat.
Right.
So, I mean, geez, so that was in their ear too. Yeah.
And we haven't heard it yet on any of the Goodman records. At least I don't think we have. An explicit Latin beat. They did choose a Latin from Manhattan on one of the Let's Dance shows, which of course was a parody of Latin numbers. But certainly, hotel bands would have Latin numbers in their repertoire. Dance bands would, as well as the strict kind of Latin bands at the time. So, and it's great to hear it make that kind of cameo appearance and come and go, because I love that type of music as well.
I think I also might have heard it on the introduction to Hunkadola.
Yeah.
There's kind of a unusual beat there just for the introduction, but yeah, that's fascinating. Speaking of quotes, Benny played his what became his classic "You're Driving Me Crazy" quote on the last bridge, and I have to say, we played this 50 years later on that PBS television show, the tribute to Fletcher Henderson, and he played the same. He played the "You Drive Me Crazy," so that was obviously a thing of his. But the trumpet, now that was Pee Wee Irwin, right? Right, Hal? That was not Nate Casebeer, I don't think.
I don't believe so.
Yeah. And also on tenor, by all rights, by virtue of the tone, it was Art Rollini, not Dick Clark, although he didn't play the notes I associate with Art Rollini, but we'll leave that open for the jury. A little bit of Frank Froba there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, absolutely fascinating. Any further comments, gents, or shall we move ahead? Or
well, I would want to commend I would like to commend the Fletcher Henderson arrangement. I thought the arrangement sounded great, and it's something, of course, as we go through these records, I'm kind of listening closer and closer to, because it was such a huge part of Goodman's success around this time. And we didn't delve into any of the Let's Dance recordings at all, which I did a rough count, and there's like 100 titles in circulation, and they broadcast for months, nearly every day, multiple times a week at least. So by this time of the band's career, they had what I think one historian estimated, over 70 Fletcher Henderson arrangements in their book, which they had been amassing over the prior few months, mainly over the Let's Dance show. So it gives a sense of how important those Fletcher Henderson arrangements were, how good they were, and how well the band played them. Which again, by the time they make it out to LA at the summer of '35 and, hit the big time, if you will, we can start to hear why that was such a huge part of that.
Yeah, true. We should mention the wonderful book about Fletcher Henderson by Jeffrey McGee, which is a wonderful source. And I think I'm glad you brought it up, because I think that we will dig deeper into Fletcher Henderson and talking about these various things which are so important. About the Let's Dance broadcasts, maybe when we're done with the studio recordings, we'll do the live ones. No, I did listen to some of them, and like you, I mean, I've been in between our sessions, I've been going back and A and Bing some of the performances with the Let's Dance things. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't hear much guitar on them. The guitar's not really well captured on those broadcasts, some better than others. But it would be fascinating to do some of those, or even to A and B, the live recordings and the studio ones. Yeah. Amazing. It's amazing, that there's so much extant. And speaking of extant, let's get back to the music. Now we'll go to something really kind of atypical. This is a medley. An Ellington medley. Here we go.
Wow.
Well, that was interesting. It sounded like a stock arrangement to my ears, and for the first, I don't know, for the first segment, it seemed rather kind of unremarkable, for lack of a better description. At any rate, there were some interesting things that eventually the group I heard the rhythm section started to work in there. We eventually heard some interesting rhythmic accents from the guitar. We heard some of those arpeggios. We've heard them before in other recordings. We've heard them a little bit more clear in other recordings. But it's really interesting. There was the first time the group went to the bridge on Sophisticated Lady, Alan Roos was playing these eighth note figures, which was another kind of like bag of tricks, stock and trade, gimmick, or however you want to characterize it, that guitar players of this period had. You hear Carmen Mastrin use it a lot on slightly later recordings, of course. And Frank Victor actually used it a fair amount with the Adrian Rollini trio. Again, recordings a little bit later. But what struck me about the use of it was something we were talking about the last session, Loren, which is what can contemporary musicians playing in a big band context glean from these recordings. And it's looking at ways to play your role within the band, and again talking about the rhythm guitar as a timekeeper, but still add some interesting musical components to the piece while still keeping time. And that's another good example of something that a guitar player can do. He's still keeping time, the time doesn't waver, but there's some embellishments that are both rhythmic and harmonic.
Yeah. Hal?
As Nick said, part of that was kind of unremarkable, to quote him. It was almost dance bandy, which is kind of a surprise when you think about how jazzy the Ellington band could be. But we know that Mr. Goodman didn't really care for Ellington's music a whole lot, so that may have informed that performance. But there are little elements of it, like Frank Froba sounding kind of like Carmen Cavallero with his little arpeggios that had nothing to do with Ellington or jazz, for that matter. Gene Krupa was really under wraps, just playing brushes. That's okay, though, because we got to hear Alan Roos a lot clearer. And at the very end, he let his sense of drama come out by playing brush rolls, which is one of the hardest things. Yeah, that's one of the hardest things to play, because the brushes don't bounce like sticks. You can work on sticks and get a roll unless you just don't know how to play drums. But playing brushes like that evenly and that smooth is really, really difficult. Well, my hat's off to him for making it sound easy.
There's a profile of Gene, and I think it's from 35, that George T. Simon did, I guess, in Metronome. And he talks about hanging out with Gene and about how he's this incessant student, and he's studying the timpani, and up in his room, I believe, and I'm sure there's people listening to this who can cite the whole article. I think of a few people in specifically, but as I remember it, he's learning the mallet instruments. He's studying with the percussionist from the Philharmonic. I don't know. He's doing all these various things, and it's worth remarking upon, because the popular perception of Gene, as he became a matinee idol with all of the stuff, didn't share much with the profile of a very serious, studied player. Who could read music and play all these various instruments and do all those kind of things. He was all that at once. Mm-hmm. And it's nice to hear an aspect of it here. I'll even strike the word almost from the description of almost dance band. Like this is, in a non-pejorative sense, just a typical stockish arrangement, according to our research. It's by Spud Murphy. And all those arrangements could turn those things out. There's nothing Spud Murphy-ish about the arrangement. There's no interesting harmony, really. There's no interesting voicings. It's just good old meat and potatoes, big band stuff. And it's what you would hear, I guess, when the band, before they really hit big, this is what they played. Make everybody happy. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely fascinating. I have a question for Nick. Does a guitarist, in those days when you would get either a stock arrangement or just the chords, and we talk sometimes about for a major seventh chord or a flat nine chord or a certain kind of chords, they would write the upper partials of the chord, as opposed to the whole thing. Because maybe rhythm players in those days were not necessarily conversant with having that voicing under their fingers, and also if you want to get a C major 7, then it would make a sense to write E minor for the guitar. Does a guitarist sometimes alter his voicings or the way that he plays his chord to be in conjunction with the harmonic voicings of a band, or back in those days, or do they just chunk out regardless of what the band's actually playing?
Well, I think it varies, as with many of these things, it varies to some extent what these people did. But yeah, I mean, from what I'm hearing on these records, guitar players definitely would change what they're playing to match the rest of the sonic picture, if you will, the harmonic picture. It's kind of the reason that eventually Freddie Green would hone it down to just a couple key notes as to kind of not step and not compete on with some of these other instruments in the band. For example, if you have a trumpet playing a high note and you're playing that note in the guitar, it's kind of pointless, because first of all, it's the trumpet's always going to win, and second of all, the sounding it where you sound it on a guitar, it's kind of out of reach of practicality, especially on a faster tune or a tune with a lot of changes. So the short answer to your question is, yeah, there's definitely, they would get the chart. For the longest time, the charts, the guitar charts didn't even have chord symbols on it. You had to be able to read staff. Sometimes you just get the piano part even, or it was just a duplication of the piano part. So there was definitely some degree of just kind of working on the fly based on your chord knowledge and your knowledge of voicings. But occasionally, you hear on records where it's definitely like, okay, this was written that, the guitar needs to be playing this chord. Yeah. It's interesting, to fast forward to contemporary big band charts, oftentimes I'll get a chart by a fairly, contemporary arranger, and the chords that are written on it are extremely detailed. Yes. And not to incriminate myself, but oftentimes I won't be playing. I don't play with what's there. It's just kind of impractical when you're at a high tempo to be playing some of these chord forms, and you just really get a sense of what works for the band. And this was a period where a lot of guitar players were figuring out what that meant. Guitar really hadn't been a big part of the jazz bands as a whole for more than a few years. The change from the banjo was only a few years in the recent past at this point in time. So, we're hearing different guitar players find out what works best for the situations.
Yeah. It's funny, the whole evolution with the bass and the guitar and the tuba and the banjo, and yet the only photo of Buddy Bolden's band has a guitar and a bass. So it's not necessarily like that, but throughout the 1920s, right? It was for the most part tuba and a banjo to cut through. In New Orleans music, I believe there had been a guitar, especially where there was no piano.
Right.
And
that's a great point, Loren. It was, and it's something that people don't talk about. It actually the history is guitar or banjo and then back to guitar, and a lot of times there was both. You look at some of these old band pictures of the early 20s and even before the 20s, and you see both banjos and guitars in the photos. If they're not holding them, they're somewhere seen in shot. So, in a lot of ways, the guitar made a comeback. Thanks in no small part to Nick Lucas in the 1920s, who kind of forced his way onto records by playing guitar on recording studios. So, but as far as like the standard, the standard switches from 1920s banjo to 1930s guitar, and
yeah, sure.
And then the orchestra changes too, right? So we're dealing with a whole different set of instruments that are being used in the mid 30s than they had been used before. So again, you're kind of fighting for your harmonic space as well as your rhythmic space.
Yeah. So many things to jump in there. I think Hal and I are both just kind of like, no, that's fascinating. I mean, there's so many things to grab at from what we just talked about. I don't even know where to start. Okay, I'll start. Tell us about Nick Lucas, because that sounds very, very interesting. What's a summary of? Please dig a little deeper into what when you referred to him, because I actually don't know. I just know his name and Tiptoe Through the Tulips or something. But
exactly. Well, and that's what most people know him for. Nick Lucas was coming from a totally different tradition. He was coming from the Italian American string player tradition, which is a whole nother set of videos. But in short, it's immigrant Italian American communities that brought old world traditions. Back in the old world, be mandolin. Once they got to the new world, there was a lot more guitar, as well as banjo. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the kind of first generation, younger generation Italian Americans were captivated by American jazz. So, and Nick Lucas was one of them. He was born around the same time Duke Ellington was, born in New Jersey. And he came up in kind of a mix of playing for the Italian American community as well as playing in vaudeville as a string player, as a banjo player, a mandolin player, and eventually a guitar player. He then started kind of playing in jazz bands proper in the late teens, early 20s. And I want to say it was close to the mid 20s, 1923, 1924. I'll have to check my date. He was playing banjo on a session and somehow convinced the band leader and then convinced the recording engineer that he should play guitar on the session. And he claimed that it was, that's what brought the guitar back into the fore. And there's definitely some historical backup to him. It may not be the very first. Again, these ideas often happen at the same place in different times, or at the same time in different places. But he was a jazz band guitar player. He eventually started getting a radio gig with just him singing and playing guitar, which is what he became known for. So by the end of the 1920s, he was having vocal hit records, but he always accompanied himself on guitar, and he was a phenomenal he was a phenomenal guitar player until his death. I mean, he retained those skills, and even kind of during his revival, which was Tiny Tim had a revival hit in the 1960s with Tiptoe Through the Tulips, which was a big Nick Lucas hit back in the 20s or maybe 1930. Even then, Nick would show up on these like late night shows playing, and he still was a great guitar player. And by all accounts, like that's how he went to his grave. So it's this kind of secret history, because everyone knows him as this crooner, for lack of a better description. And yet he was a very capable and interesting jazz guitar player.
Now, before I get back to Hal, because I've got some, I'd like to talk about that Ben Burney 1925 Sweet Georgia Brown film. But before we get there, so Nick Lucas was a pop commercial star, big selling records, and his face on probably on the record jacket and in the ads and all that. Now, how do we understand Johnny St. Cyr, Lonnie Johnson, and Eddie Lang, who I guess by 26, 27, are well known enough to be featured on records. Now, I guess Lonnie Johnson would be on what they called race records back in those days. Of course, he's on Hotter Than That and some of the Armstrong records. And Eddie Lang, Where are they in the constellation in terms of what was happening with the guitar in jazz in context with Nick Lucas?
Well,
others?
again, it's like a lot of similar things happening at the same time in different places and in different communities.
Right.
And the interesting thing about the guitar is that it's coming from, you have these different influences coming in. From the Italian American influence, you have someone like Nick Lucas, who's absorbing jazz and Black American influences. Eddie Lang's really coming from a similar place. Eddie Lang is coming from an Italian American community in Philadelphia, was brought up, learned music in a very similar way that Nick Lucas did, although he was a little bit younger than Nick Lucas. Definitely had more of, Nick always kind of retained a slightly earlier jazz feel, a little bit more of a ragtime influenced feel in both his style and approach, as well as a vaudeville feel. Eddie definitely was more into the kind of real stuff, if you will, as far as jazz is concerned. And I realized I just, probably got myself in trouble there. But what I mean is, records that were made in the early 20s, mid 20s, that people really consider, great jazz records. And at the same time, Eddie always retained that sense of Italian American identity. I mean, he's very much out of that tradition, but moves more to the fore as far as what we consider jazz, and starts introducing guitar elements that later guitar players, notably for our conversation, George Van Epps, but everybody from Bernard Addison to Fred Guy with Duke Ellington to Lawrence Lucy, to Dick McDonough, they all talked about Eddie Lang as being this point of inspiration. And even though Eddie's rhythm is a little bit stiff, I'll call it. It's just not quite there. It's just not quite as flowing on some of these records than I think we would expect it to be from a jazz guitar player, quote unquote. He starts pulling these things together and providing a template and certainly an inspiration for the next generation of guitarists that would come. The other important thing about Eddie to make mention of, he became Bing Crosby's accompanist.
Right.
So much like Nick Lucas, you have this time period from the late 20s into the early 30s where they're the first guitar heroes. They're the first stars that are playing guitars, if you'll pardon that phrase that I just said. So they're anyway.
How about Lonnie Johnson?
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, Lonnie Johnson was developing a slightly different style, coming from his own background, much more blues influenced as well as jazz influenced, and unfortunately, was consigned to the race records kind of side of the industry. Of course, famously, Lonnie Johnson and Eddie Lang made records together, which is a great example of early collaboration. But a lot of what Lonnie Johnson did was kind of consigned to the kind of blues heaps, if you will. There's a lot of blues records being made at this time, which oftentimes jazz historians, collectors, whatever you want to consider them, they kind of look at those differently. Even though there was a lot of crossover, Lonnie Johnson was making records with Eddie Lang. Lonnie Johnson was recording with Duke Ellington, except a lot of the times he's considered an early blues artist. So, there's kind of the danger of labels and, the challenge of looking at history. And then, add to that, everyone that's playing with jazz bands proper, Johnny Sinclair, et cetera, they're coming from yet another tradition. Maybe if you want to think about it, a more direct connection to New Orleans jazz, that went up through the Delta and ends up in Chicago, et cetera.
Hal, I mentioned before that Ben Burney clip from 1925, but what I meant to get at is, and I think we're gonna get to some music here, and we can talk about it after the next track also, which is about the drum set. And if you think like this is 1935, think of Max Roach and Sid Catlett and whomever in 1945, and then go back and think about 1925. Right. I got some a whole bunch of things that I would like to ask you about when we get there.
Okay.
Let's go to the next track. This is a Fletcher Henderson arrangement. And this is, in my estimation, one of his very, very best. It's still not that well known. Benny didn't record it for quite some time. And he never, it's not featured much, although there are a lot of broadcast versions. But for whatever reason, it's rarely mentioned. I think it's one of his best. And it has kind of almost like a boogie shout chorus before Boogie Woogie arrived, really. So anyway, let's go to it. This is I Can't Give You Anything But Love, another Fletcher Henderson classic. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you something. We enjoyed hearing that so much that we all changed our clothes just to come back and talk about this one tune. That's how good it was. We all just looked and said, "You know what? That was so good, man. I just feel like breaking in a new pair of shoes." So, which you can't see. Actually, be thankful you can't see. But anyway, that was I Can't Give You Anything But Love. And that I would nominate that as like one of the best Fletcher Henderson arrangements. I'd say it's one of the best Fletcher Henderson arrangements that's the least known as a classic. They didn't record it till a few years later for Victor. And even then, it just wasn't that well known. But anyway, it's a masterpiece. This was a very interesting version. They took a cut. There's a chorus missing. And there's also, and I think this is the first time I've ever heard it, Toots Mondello can do no wrong, but he was human. Actually, I never knew it before. There's a little goof there in the alto for a moment, which really kind of highlights, I guess, what we've been listening to with the other titles from this session. They were in the studio, man, one take each, 51 tunes in a row, and if there was a goof, screw it, just keep plowing through. And I'll tell you something, I'll take a Goodman record with a cut and a goof over probably most other bands' perfect records. But that was really wonderful. Pee Wee Irwin on the trumpet, Frank Froba on the piano, and Benny on the clarinet. So what did you hear? Why don't we go to Hal, and we'll start with the drums.
Okay. Also, that wonderful arrangement. I love that staccato kind of Harlem feel that Fletcher Henderson arranged there, like sort of like Benny Carter, some of Alex Hill's arrangements. Dut, 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 but it swings. It's not at all stiff. It almost liberates the guys in the band to just loosen up and blow.
Yeah.
What that's one of the best Henderson arrangements I think I've heard. I love that. The Pee Wee Irwin solo is beautiful, very Bunny Berrigan-like to my ears, with Gene Krupa laying in on the hi-hat underneath and just pushing Pee Wee to play even better by playing that really solid rhythm underneath. It sounded a little bit like James P. Johnson when Frank Froba played. I didn't.
Yeah, very little. No,
yeah,
just joking.
I didn't hear his usual Hines playing on that. It sounded more stride-like and more Johnson than Waller or Willie the Lion Smith or any of the other Harlem players. Of course, he could have heard him very easily in New York since he was there for so long. Went right from New Orleans to New York, and he would have been there during James B's heyday. So that's kind of interesting to think about. And he played a little boogie woogie figure at the very end of the piece. I don't know if that was written in the piano part or if that's just something he came up with. But
it's in the orchestration, actually.
Is it? Okay. That was very effective. What a neat way to end the tune. And of course, Gene Krupa playing open crashes behind Benny. That always seemed to inspire Benny to really push himself a little bit more. That was a A1 arrangement and playing by everybody from beginning to end.
Nick?
Well, again, the Roos and Harry Goodman rhythm team just sound fantastic on this. There's some really interesting moments where they really straighten out that beat, like I've talked about. Going from emphasizing their respective 1 and 3 or 2 and 4 beats to really locking in and playing 4/4 time together in a nice even flowing motion. And they kind of do it in some unexpected places here. We hear it underneath one of the solos, which is we've heard on other records before. It becomes a bit of a device, but it's even in the first chorus of the arrangement they straighten out for just a couple bars, which makes me wonder if that was written out or something they came up with. I'd have to listen to the later arrangement to see if there's anything like that in there. But again, like kind of exemplary playing on the part of both of them. And a lot of what I've talked about in terms of, Roos being known for emphasizing these backbeats, the 2 and 4, we're hearing it, how well he did it and why it's so effective on a tune like this, and both echoing the Lawrence Lucy approach as well as having such a crisp attack in his strumming. It's just great to hear. Yeah. And Frank Froba, again, as Hal said, there's some really interesting moments, when the piano goes into the solo. I don't think Roos dropped out entirely on this one. I thought I heard him kind of keeping some propulsion going underneath the solo. But just showing a guitarist how to effectively use dynamics over the course of arrangement, depending on what instruments are being put to the fore. I mean, it's I often talk about the rhythm guitar being like another drum, and much like a drummer will change his attack and which drums, which percussion instruments they go to, depending on the soloist. A guitarist in this context should be thinking of in the same manner, and Roos gives us an indication of how to do that. And again, like Hal said, I love the little boogie woogie figure at the end. That was a great touch. And yeah.
Well, it's very interesting because here they are recording this chart in June of '35. And if I'm not mistaken, that's before Honky Tonk Train Blues. I mean, that's before, Mead Lux Lewis and the influx of Boogie Woogie. You know, I mean, there had been touches of it. I mean, there was Pine Tops, Boogie Woogie was 1929. But it's just unusual to hear it, I mean, so clearly a boom, 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 boom. You know, they wrote Boogie Woogie for the big band in the coda. I'd like to jump just back and talk a little bit more about the drums, because I think that it's important to underline that the way that Krupa is creating his own drum parts for these arrangements, right? In other words, Sonny Greer did the same thing with Ellington famously. I mean, there were no drum parts in the Ellington Orchestra, as far as, I mean, I've seen all the scores and all the parts, and there's next to nothing. Sonny Greer invented all of that. That great statement by Ellington, he said, well, Sonny, you know, for every ping the orchestra did, Sonny knew the perfect pong. Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm paraphrasing there. But in terms of Krupa, you know, not that he wasn't the only drummer who was inventive, but it seems to me that in terms of the more modern, let's take modern out, that in terms of the way that the language of playing big band drums evolved, that you can actually take a lot of what he is doing and how he's doing it, and it's still what people are playing today, in terms of the basic way of hitting the accents and making the sounds. Whereas a lot of the contemporary drummers of the 30s, when you listen to, maybe even including Chick Webb, in a certain kind of way, are you utilizing effects and techniques that have gone by the wayside, which is not to say that they aren't perfect and wonderful in their own way. But Krupa, really, I mean, you know, this is so interesting just to underline his importance, because, again, so many times he's poo-pooed. We had ping pong, now poo-pooed, and next we'll have the poo-poo platter, but that's another story. But because, you know, Gene Krupa, the first rock star, I've heard that, and he may be in a certain kind of way,
Yeah.
with the hair and with the, you know, and with the drums and with the plainly sexual, you know, stuff that he's doing there. Sometimes it just is, you know, there's no way around it. You know, it has that thing that Elvis. I mean, you know, he's the first Elvis in some ways, you know.
Yeah.
But so they tend to overlook the positive drumistic points. And I know that we've talked about this, and we will talk about it more in the future episodes, because we're still very early in the Thesaurus Rhythm Makers here. But at times like that, I really think, like, you know, he's just so contemporary and so musical. And I'm wondering what you guys think. You know, if I made this statement that that, you know, his best playing. Now again, best. What the hell is best? I'll say the playing that I prefer of Gene Krupa's as an ensemble musician is with the Goodman Band up through somewhere in 37 and 38. And from that point on, when he became a band leader, it's almost the same like with Lionel Hampton and Krupa. When they were with Goodman, I think they played their best in a certain kind of way as ensemble players and as giving, listening kind of players. And once they became band leaders, they had a different responsibility, and they had to, it's just a different thing, and you can't judge it in the same. But as the sideman, I mean, most of my favorite Hampton is with Goodman, and 90% of my favorite Krupa is with Goodman. Does that ring any bells?
Yeah, and I think after his band leading experience, when Krupa made the series of town hall concerts with Eddie Condon, he went back quite a bit to what he had played with Goodman. More of a sideman, a featured sideman. I mean, he had lots of solos, and there were no restrictions on what he could do, but he didn't overplay. He played what was called for and made it exciting, and to my ears, very tasteful in what he played, and a lot of the older styles too, playing choke cymbal, press rolls. But I can think of a bunch of Condon broadcasts where he played very similar to what we heard just now on I Can't Give You Love, with the open crash cymbal, the rim shots to punctuate somebody's phrase. Otherwise, I agree with you that his best playing was with Goodman. And I think he also, being familiar with charts like this, they must have played this a lot before they went on to do these Rhythm Makers recordings. He was able to self-edit am I going to play every one of these hits that's in the drum part, or just the important ones?
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like to me.
And I can tell you that there are virtually no hits in the drum part. The Fletcher Henderson drum parts, in fact, maybe, I don't think I can do it on this broadcast, but at some point I'll show one of them. They are really play 8, play 8, play 8, play 8, play 16, play 16, then maybe half note, an eighth note, and an X with a cymbal crash, and an eighth note.
Okay.
Play 8, play 16. There's nothing there.
Well, that's good.
You know,
that's even better than he was underlining some of the important little
Right.
rhythmic phrases there that
Right.
the ensemble was playing, and he added emphasis to it without making it sound stiff.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Another thing, I just, for our Gene Krupa fans out there, chiming in, no pun intended, with how about later Krupa. I mean, I did not mean to dismiss any and all of the later Krupa. You happen to know the Condon recordings very well. There's also, some Norman Granz dates. There's the date with Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa with Dizzy, Roy Eldridge, and others. And there's Gene's Blues and Buddy's Blues. And Gene's Blues on that one, to me, is also just like what you're talking about. Is Gene Krupa, the beautiful band drummer, just being one of the guys, so to speak. And yet he's so recognizable. That click-clackety, that sound of his snare drum sound. I mean, he was definitely, what Mel Lewis used to call a signature drummer. In other words, you just know it's Gene Krupa. You know what I mean? It's so interesting. Well, so there you have it. I can't give you anything but love. We're at the end of one of our early sessions here for the Thesaurus Rhythm Maker. So thanks, Hal. Thanks, Nick. And we'll see you next time.